This is the Regenerative Real Estate Podcast. Revitalizing the world together. Hi there, podcast listeners. This is your host, Neil Collins. Thank you so much for tuning in again to another great episode that we have lined up for you with Jake Fry. Jake is the founder and CEO of Smallworks Studios, which is a laneway housing builder out of Vancouver BC. And in this show, we jump straight into talking about laneways and what we're calling ADUs in the US. These, if you don't know what that is, think small houses. Think backyard cottage or a garden suite. And so I wanted to preface the show with that. I also want to give a big shout out to our company, Latitude. Our company enables this work to take place. We are a Portland-based sales and development company, and we really are trying to help people live in more thoughtful and resilient ways. We do that because we believe sustainability is a force for good. Thank you again for tuning in. If you want to support our show, please go to iTunes or wherever you're listening to this podcast. Leave us a review and share it with your friends and colleagues. It means so much, and I hope you enjoy this podcast episode. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Regenerative Real Estate Podcast. I'm joined with me today by Jake Fry, who is the founder and principal of Smallworks Studios, which is a design build firm for what they call laneway housing in Vancouver, BC. We know that in the States by ADUs or granny flats. I'm really excited because Jake is a builder, a change maker, and a progressive housing advocate, and just does some phenomenal work. So Jake, thank you for coming on, and welcome to the show.
Oh, well, thank you as well. It's a real pleasure to be here and talk about this. This is always it's great to find like-minded people and share these common interests. So.
Yeah, Jake, I read in your background that you grew up in a small town in Ontario, and I really wanted to first give everybody listening a sense of who you are and where you come from, because it's so few and far between that you come out of school and you know exactly the direction that you're going to be headed in, and all of a sudden you're running a design build firm. So what is your background?
Well, I use this term up here in Canada, which is where I'm speaking from. It's sort of being the quintessential child of Trudeau, meaning that, I'm 57 years old now. I grew up in the 70s going to grade school. And in Canada, it was a really interesting time. I mean, we have a very thriving socialist government, and we still do. I mean, and back then it was really, I think, the best days of it in many respects. I think when you look at across North America, these indexes my wife had talked to me about, who's a sociologist, and she said, it was actually the point where people were the happiest, they were the most content. And it's that sort of set my childhood. So there I am growing up in a kind of rural area, just outside a small town, as a hobby farm, and it was quite an idyllic childhood in some respects. But speaking to that point about where that sits politically, is that we were at a time where the lessons we were learning in school were very much about inclusion and multiculturalism, and how a dynamic society coexists with different things operating in equal parts, and there's overlap and there's separation, and all those have great validity. And it was out of that kind of value set, which I think is very laudable, and I still hold to that. I think a lot of our work is still based in that idea, or those morals, as it were. And I don't think I got out of high school knowing what I was going to do at all. But I did have, when I was doing working on my undergrad, I had worked up north in the mines and had learned a lot of carpentry there, and growing up on a farm, there was always that need. So, and I had, different, I worked in film for a while, and doing props, and had other aspirations in that as well, and some art direction. But candidly, that was never a successful endeavor, but carpentry always was. And it was always there to kind of prop me up and keep me going financially, and through traveling, which I like to do a lot when I was younger, it was always there as an activity. And, you know, I was always drawn to architecture and what cities were like, and wanted to walk down little back corners to see what was, you know, sort of around the next little area. And that attraction has never left me. And it's something that I think is, you know, that's the dynamic part of cities. And I think growing up in the country too, is you always aspire to sort of having this more metropolitan existence. And I certainly was very happy and moved to, at the time, Toronto, which was sort of Canada's largest city. I don't know if it's the most dynamic one. And then I've been in Vancouver now for close to 20 years, and I love it here. It's, my wife's from here, and it's just the best place to live. And it's a nice city, and it has a lot of those features we were talking about. So I think it was more out of those culmination of those interests driving together, and sort of having this sort of social place of trying to always, you know, being a middle child too. That's most important, where you try and make peace at all times between dynamic forces. So I think there's that disposition, there's this value set that I love, and then there's this great attraction to the built form of architecture and those little tucked away places, and all those I think really culminated in that desire to really have this company and to start to see that built form take hold in North America.
And so bring us from Toronto to Vancouver. Did you move to the city, or were you living outside?
Well, my wife had, as I mentioned, is academic, and she had a sabbatical. She was from here, and she would spend her summers here, and a lot of our early courtship had us coming out here in the summers, and it's just a wonderful place. I mean, it really is a truly special place. And we would go up to one of the Gulf Islands and spend our summers there, which is this to be in that level of nature is terrific. But the city itself is, you know, I quite like it, and we would spend time here with her folks, her mom. And then from there, Beth, we had made the decision to move at one point, that we just wanted to be here rather than be in Toronto, and our daughter was quite young, and that's moving here rather than to a more rural area was just what we needed to do to, you know, she got a job at one of the local universities, and I started making my way as a carpenter, and got set up and worked in town for a couple of years. Meanwhile, all the time walking through all the beautiful back alleys and looking at what they had done in these, you know, little artist studios, or, you know, basketball hoops on garages, and people working on their cars. And it's always kind of the interesting part. It's sort of like, you know, peeking around the corner, walking down the alleys, you sort of see what life is really going on, right? Rather than just the pristine mowed lawn out front and cars parked on the street. And it was really, you know, so there's something I was already attracted to it. I had a couple of friends who were architects here and had seen the work they were doing, and a lot of them were sort of working on heritage projects, and I really liked that. And heritage projects here, you know, at the time often involved a second unit or something extra being added to the house. And so I would say there is kind of this one little moment. So there's all this is happening. Meanwhile, and when we talk about the real estate here, we can talk about this, but I was working on what has become and remains a bit of a trend here, which is these Uber monster homes. These are, you know, so I was working with a builder doing finished carpentry, and the homes we were working on were anywhere from 16,000 to 10,000 square feet. And I remember quite distinctly, I was putting crown molding, which I'm not great at, in a bathroom. And this little 4-year-old walked in with her mom, and her mom's like, "Well, this will be your bathroom, honey." And I'm just going, wow, like this bathroom is, you know, this is like bigger than my child's bedroom. And you know, I spoke to the mom, and, you know, it became clear that this house with a built-in pool that was 16,000 square feet was going to house a family of 3. And I just couldn't, I knew it was there, but just to see it in that level of kind of in your face, and to be struggling with something and looking at the resources that were going into this house that were ostensibly this housing 3 people. They would probably have more staff in the end than they did family members, I would think. And then I just remember looking out the window, and there was this unpaved alley, as you would call it. And there's greenery and some backyards, and I was going, man, you could build 30 houses. From what I see here, you could just build 30 little beautiful houses, and you know, little kids would have places to live, and there'd be kids out playing hockey the laneway or basketball. And you know, it was within a week I just put my tools down, and that was it. And I just said, I'm going to start this company. My idea was to do little houses that didn't require permits. So not tiny houses, but little 10 by 10 studios, and there would be someone's library or their writing room. And I did that for a little while, but it was quite evident that everyone wanted to have a place like this to live in. And I spent the next 4 years advocating, building those little units, but also advocating with the city and finally getting the city to do what was, I think, an incredibly brave motion. And they actually made these, what we call laneway houses or ADUs, they made them a citywide opportunity for pretty much everybody with a single family lot. So they basically opened up 60,000 building sites.
And so in 2005, you incorporated your company, thinking that you were going to build something that wasn't exactly housing, it was just smaller format places. Like, are you thinking a library or?
No, they were just going to be extra rooms, you know, like your brother was visiting for the weekend, maybe they would do, I mean, people would use these spaces as they would use it. But the idea is, how can we get better land use out of these lots that are anywhere from 5,000 to 6,000 square feet? And they typically, if it's an older home, it's, you know, under 3,000 square feet. So their density is quite modest. You know, it's not even 60% a lot. And typically, you know, even then the demographic was aging. So you had fewer and fewer people on these properties. And it was really like, what can we do to make, there was two drivers. One was just my own affinity to wanting to make beautiful little structures. You know, I want to make something that's really beautiful, that's quaint, it's in the backyard, that people are attracted to. Like, as a builder, I think you like to do that. But then there was this other component, was like, how do we get housing? Because housing even then was just so unattainable. And it's continued to march further and further ahead of any a semblance of people being aspired to home ownership. It's just, you know, like typically if you were looking at buying a single family home and you were moving to Vancouver, and you look at the gradient of what people make, you know, through our census as an income, maybe 4% of the population could afford to buy a home. Wow. Not outright, but they could afford to buy, they have the income that will warrant carrying a mortgage.
And so where was the zoning legislation at the time? Could you build a permitted 800 square foot house in the backyard?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And so to give it some background, and I am no way was the first person to ever think of this. There was, you know, many people going back. I think there's lots of progressive work here in the 70s and 80s. There had been things like people were allowed to cut their lots in half and make these 12, 13 foot wide homes. There were opportunities where people were doing multiple units on single family lots. But again, as property values went up, as people were still in the workforce, as people were reacting to making neighborhoods that had become working class neighborhoods becoming more and more gentrified, for some reason, you know, as we do, those become more and more exclusive and people become more and more protectionary. So a lot of those really good ideas that were happening in the 70s and 80s, they dissipated from the scape. People, you know, had probably by the late 90s, citywide, we had a junior ADU, as you call it. So we had basement suites, and that they were illegal. They were all over the place because people needed housing, people needed income, and putting a suite in your basement was a pretty easy way and low impact to get some revenue in and supply housing. So where these ideas came, they existed in the past, right? What didn't happen was a political will to kind of keep them going. And in addition to that, what we really felt was that the housing problem became more acute. But where we did see these infills existing still were around homes that were warranted preservation. And typically, if you were going to go, okay, I'm going to protect my home forever in perpetuity as a heritage house, you had the ability to have gain some sort of compensation for that. And the compensation usually took the form of an infill, what we call an infill house, which is basically a bigger ADU. And often you could sell that. And it had been used in a tool in a couple of areas that people wanted to preserve as kind of more heritage areas as well. This is an incentive so the older housing stock wasn't being torn down to replace with a bigger house. So what we did was we used that and said, well, look at this beautiful neighborhood with these beautiful old, lovely looking coach houses, which they tend to be referred to. The idea of it being, something that was literally a coach house for a manor, that kind of terminology was used a lot. And that's a very friendly thing. And it speaks to, affluence and, gentrification and all sorts of things. And so that became a bit more palatable. But I think the core was that people were really struggling with affordability. And the more we could put forth this as a viable option, and really that's what my job was for 5 years. I had a modest construction company, but I was basically an advocate, touting what the virtues of this built form was for the city. And to this day, I think we remain in some conflict with the voices that say, no, we're going to get affordability by building big towers, and we're going to get great buildings doing that. We're going to get green buildings doing that, and we're going to be able to house a lot of people. And I think it's it's not an accurate portrayal, because we're going to house people taking 65% of our land mass and doing a very low impact housing across the city that gives people ground orientated housing that they can afford, they can raise a family in, and creates a much more dynamic environment for local businesses, for quality of life. And quite candidly, I think in the end, it creates a much more greener building. Overall, the embedded carbon is much better, especially as we preserve more and more housing. But hand in glove with that is that I think that quality of life builds community. And it really, I think our biggest challenge here, and it's another trajectory I'm sure a conversation will take, is speculation. And I think at its core, that really curtails speculation in a very meaningful way.
And I think it spreads people out more evenly through neighborhoods. So it's in where we are in Portland, it's very condensed down on corridors, and you've got a lot of people living in these towers, and it's very hard to create that community centric feel to it. To the places that you were building and you are building now, what's the typical size that you would say?
Well, I mean, it's definitely generated from the bylaw. I think if we had free reign to do whatever, it might be a different size. But what we're finding is that we build not really much smaller than 600 square feet. And we were capped out at a building that would be, about 950 square feet. Call it 1,000, because there's obviously there's always a way to work with the zoning to get some extra storage and so forth. So 5 to 1,000 square feet is generally the size home we're doing. If we could do anything, I think I'd really like to see an opportunity to do some smaller units for students at 300 square feet. And I'd like to see some family units that were maybe a bit more generous at 1,200 square feet. There's a neighboring city we work in where we build 1,200 square feet quite regularly. And that's really good. Like, you can have 3 or 4 kids in that size of house, and the cost difference is so modest. Like, what we find is that, in that range of size, and it's very specific. Once you get over 1,200 square feet, it's a different equation. But under 1,200 square feet, the difference between a 600 square foot space and a 1,200 square feet, it's nothing. It's, your cost to build it is under $50,000. I mean, you're dealing with really a bit of labor, which is easily amortized. And material wise, you could probably fit the material in 3 pickup truckloads. It's not like, you're not dealing with an exorbitant amount of stuff. The challenge with the small home is that it's hard to get the sweet spot of the efficiency. And that's why I like these opposing things. At 300 square feet, you can actually do something which would be terrific housing for a single person. You can, obviously you have lots of room, hopefully, to do a really beautiful garden, and living in a temperate zone as you are in Portland, it really creates an extra living area that for 3/4 of the year is viable, active space. And for that other period of the year that you're not using it, it can be a really beautiful 3D TV. But and then the 1,200 square foot, obviously, it's just because you can actually make a pretty nice family home at that size. So, but I think that's the range of what a small house is. I mean, Ross is great when he defines a small house. He says it's just enough. You have, a small house is like you have exactly what you need. There's no surplus, but you're not suffering because of the lack of surplus. You have exactly what you need to be comfortable and make a home.
I'm going to go a bit more philosophical on this because I'm a big fan of vernacular architecture because of the ability that it can change over time, where we're not just building a house that we think is going to be immutable, but 50 years from now, is it going to look different than it does today? Because likely it will. What do you think is going to happen with your designs? And I've actually heard that a couple of your developments have been torn down tragically just a short number of years after that they were put up, just to show the dynamics of the real estate market up there.
Yeah, it's true. That's heartbreaking. I think that just to answer your question about that, I want to preface it. I'm not an architect. I think over the years I have a sensibility for design, but the architects I work with are better. My spouse is better than I am. But, I have affinities to certain things, and I tend to like traditional architecture. I think it stands the test of time. I mean, it was, I think it's Charles Lawson. I read his book, The Country Home, which was written in the late 1700s, and it sort of sets the tone of what the North American vernacular on housing will be. And it is remarkable how well it's stood the test of time. But notwithstanding that, everyone's influenced by Dwell, unfortunately. I want to do a blog called Ravaged by Dwell. We'll look at all the houses that aren't really good, that make gestures to being modern. But, I think it really all comes down to how well something is made, how well it functions inside around the flow, and, where's the hearth, where's the center of the house, how does this house function? But when we look at, and which we often do first, where we look at the outside, it's really to do with, as much as I like well-proportioned, much as I like traditional, it really comes down to how something's proportioned, and that is the rub, right? And that's where the talented architect, the talented designer finds just that right spot, right? And it's just perfect. The eave is that deep. It's not an inch more, it's not an inch less. And that balance, when you get it, it really makes something more than itself. There's this great fellow that I really admired. I saw his work when I was up in the Gulf Islands. His name is Lloyd House. He's a carpenter, but he's an artist. He's made these amazing houses. He's just sort of one of those hippie builders from the 60s. And I had the good fortune to meet him once. I told him how influential he was, and he was very generous. And he was showing me something that he was building. And I said, well, how do you, I put that to him. How do you know what to do with that eave? And he was an artist. He would just go around the house. He goes, well, I have this thing. I go around the house, I build it, and then I look at it, and then I do another layer, and I do another layer. And, like the artist building up the canvas, he would do it. I think there's other people. There's a fellow I work with in town, or I know, I've worked with a little bit. His name's Jim Bussey. He's an amazing architect, and he's got a company called Formworks. I think he's singularly done more to create good architecture in Vancouver than anybody else in that single family form. And he's a very, very much a formalist. But you look at his houses and you go, wow, that's great. And to your point, I was walking down the street. We've all been walking with the pandemic, sort of burning off the kilometers because we're all working from home. And I passed by this little townhouse complex. I'd never seen it before. Really beautiful, kind of Georgian white brick. And I texted Jim, I go, is this yours? I've never seen it before. And he goes, yeah, I did that 20 years ago. And I was thinking it was something that was literally finished a couple of months ago. I just never seen it. For whatever reason, it was on a street that I hadn't been down, and I looked brand new. And not that brand new is important, but speaking to your thing about like how do we create things that are going to stand the test of time, right? And that's, I think it's easily done, but it's not a complicated thing. You know, it's a thoughtful thing.
I will say, when looking at other laneway houses, there's a lot of product out there that just, it's aesthetically unpleasing. It looks a bit cheap because it was designed to be as affordable as possible, and it serves a need. But whenever I look at your designs and your houses, it portrays a very different story. They are beautiful from the very get-go. And is that you and your company that's designing these, or are you working with outside architects? Because it is a very different feel.
No, it's us. And it's us working collectively. You know, as I said, I mean, it's the designers that drive this, not me. I think I sort of set the stage and I go, look, we have to do things that are simple and elegant. And, you know, we haven't had the same people throughout our history. And I think the houses that we do at the time reflect the stronger individuals. And unfortunately, there's some houses that are probably could have been a bit more than they were because we had weaker people working with us at the time. But we have a really good core group now that's been together for a few years, and we've nailed it. We've really dialed it in, I think, and we'll continue to get better. And it's very generous of you to compliment us, by the way. It's very kind of you. It's something we take a lot of pride in, and the other thing too is that you have to. One needs to bear in mind that, you know, while we're probably the most prolific builder in our region, we also have really have a very narrow, purposely a very narrow focus in our work. We won't work in a project where the principal residence has been torn down. We generally, because our work, and we are a bit more expensive for sure, but you know, you get what you pay for. And the core of I guess the driver is that and part of our homes are really beautiful because our clients are living in them, right? And so not that we would do bad work otherwise, but I think they're, you know, we want to leave like one of our core messages in our company is that we want to make great houses, but we want to make great friends as we do that. And so, you know, I can't go shopping at our local grocery store without stopping and speaking to a past client, you know, and asking how the kids are, or they're asking me how my daughter's doing. And that happens a lot. And it's great. You know, there's nobody, there's very few people I wouldn't want to spend some social time with at the completion of the job because we've worked on it together. But for us, you know, because we do the volume of work that we do, we're just really focused and organized, and we really work on fixed price contracts and really try to mitigate any surprises that can come up. And I think that does a lot to allow us to be able to have people take a risk on doing something that might be more elaborate because they know what it's going to cost. It's not a rabbit hole they're going down with no end in sight. And because we work on that level and that level of trust that we set in when we're doing the work to prep the job, because we need extra time to prep that type of job, that allows us to build it really quickly too, because we're not really dealing with things that all the decisions have been made beforehand. So the execution is just that, it's execution, it's not development.
So after several hundred of these homes, what's the clientele like? Are they living in them, or is it for elderly parents or students that are living in them?
Well, if you were to take a look at the program across the city, I think we're in excess of 5,000 homes that have been built over this a little over 10 years that the program's been in place. We built 300, but you need to break out that number a little bit because generally about 70% of the lane houses that are put in Vancouver are part of this normal house replacement. So every year, on average, you know, traditionally the number has been about 700 homes or taken down. and replaced with a new home, whether it's a builder who's bought a lot and he's building a property for sale, whether it's a homeowner who's bought something and they're building a dream house, or whether it's just somebody who's, those are probably the two main areas that's happening. But for any one reason, we're having, maybe replacement because of fire or something like that. So whenever those homes go in, 85, 90, 100% of the time, there's a lane house put in because it's free square footage. So why would you not do that? So we don't do any of that work. So that leaves us with a much smaller cohort of homes that we're playing in, and we have about 20% of that market share, maybe a bit more. And for us, to your point, that market share tends to be a very typical build for us is a young couple in their 30s, and one of the parents is allowing them to use a property to build their first home. They've gone out, they had a golden retriever, they bought a condo, they've done something, to see if this is going to be a permanent partnership, and now they're going to make the jump and have a family, and they want a single family home, and this is the only way they're ever going to get it, is to build on the parents' property. So that's a really typical client for us. Sometimes it's the same scenario, but the kids are taking over the principal residence because they have a growing family, they have a few kids, and the folks are moving in the back because they just want to downsize, and it's time for that. And sometimes, not as frequently, but sometimes we'll have maybe two people who bought a property together, and this is their way to have sort of an ad hoc joint ownership. Or somebody has been in the housing market, they got in early, now they're moving on to the next housing that's maybe a bigger house or a more expensive house, and they put in a laneway house as a vehicle for this affordability. It's going to afford them the mortgage and the income. I mean, the in Vancouver, for good or bad, the laneway homes command a fair rent, and generally you're almost making, if you're to finance them, you're making almost 100% profit on your monthly servicing costs. So, wow. Or close to it, certainly over 50%. So you're in the black pretty much right away if you're looking at cash flow.
In Vancouver, can you build one laneway house, or multiple allowed?
No, just one. You can have, again, using cross-indexing, language that I know from California, every house pretty much can have a junior ADU, 100%, and most do. Most have something, again, usually configured as a basement suite. Sometimes it's just it might be a front back kind of configuration, but generally it's a basement suite. And then every single family home under, a pretty broad set of criteria can have a laneway house or a full ADU.
Wait, do you think that pushing for more density like that, to have two laneway houses, would be helpful for the city?
Well, I mean, we do have that now. So every single family property, in many respects, it could, on some level, function like a triplex. That's still pretty low density. Like you're dealing with a density that's has lots of green space, lots of personal space, lots of social distancing. That you're not a lot of people in the property, and considering that most households are still, not more than 3 people. You're really, and usually that junior ADU is for one person or a couple. You're dealing with, there may be more built space, but when we go back to the 30s, when a lot of our housing stock first went in the neighborhoods we're discussing, it was very typical for people to have maybe 4 kids, right? And a grandparent living in a house. So you had, whatever size house that was, quite small, housing maybe 6 or 7 people. You're now spreading that over a larger part of the property and multiple domiciles. So I don't think it's a density issue. I don't consider this to be a density issue. I think this should be considered a revitalization issue.
One of the very interesting things that I read about your advocacy work was that parking was initially perceived to be a threat towards our conventional lifestyles of single family living. And you did something that I believe is true. And I'd like to get the story on that you went to neighbors to do surveys. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the things we did, I had this work, and it was that we were advocating. It was under the banner of my, of Smallworks, of the sole proprietorship. And then as we sort of got more established and we wanted to take that advocacy work province wide, or, and we really realized that it became essential that we created a separate arm that functioned in that. And we weren't just promoting lane homes, and we promote other forms, because I think there's lots of opportunities for different types of smaller housing. It doesn't just have to be an ADU. And so that exists. So the first project we did, we had a local credit union here. We raised some money through them, and we interviewed the 9 direct neighbors of the first 300 laneway homes that were built in the city. And it wasn't us. It was we hired a survey company, and it was interesting what came out of that. The big takeaways were that the biggest fear was parking, that this somehow was going to impact parking. 3 years later, the biggest fear was parking. It was this kind of, I think it was very much like like anything fear driven. The fear still stays there. I'm going to get eaten by a shark if I go swimming in the bay, right? You still feel bad, even though there's no sharks there, right? But what we found was more interesting was that a few things. One, we've figured out through our survey, and prior to that, the city had done some. There's about 65% of the garages did not house cars.
Wow.
And the program actually mandates one exterior parking stall. So we were increasing on-site parking, even though we were taking away a garage. Number 2 is that about 30% of those neighbors, after the house had been in more than 2 years, were actually contemplating a laneway house for themselves. And I think you could talk to people in the street, and if you got together a bunch of people, there's going to be some people who don't like it. But I would say, to say that it didn't have widespread acceptance, you have to work hard to make that argument true here now, right? There are people who don't like laneway homes, but there's people who don't like anything happening in their neighborhood. You have more control over a laneway house being built beside you than you do in a monster home being built beside you. So when we start to look at what is the impact on a neighborhood, what creates neighborliness, that's where I think we find the acceptance in the laneway house program, because it's the neighborhood stays the same. Susie, who I remember when she went to grade school, is now living next door and is going to have a baby in a year or in a few months. That's a change you can live with pretty easily, right?
The hidden density, and this brings up a very banal question, but are all laneway houses on laneways in Vancouver?
They are, but when we look at the region, and as more and more cities start to look at this built form, that you can have it without. I mean, it's a very convenient as a builder. It's a very convenient way to approach this, because it's on-site construction's readily accessible, right? But it's not essential, and there's places that have, most places, if they don't have a lane, they have a garage in the back and you drove through the front, and so there's accessibility that way. We don't have to look at one thing. I mean, I think the laneway house discussion is terrific, and obviously it's something that's near and dear to my heart. But I mean, in Portland, you've been doing great with those little 4 and 6 pack, housing developments on the corners, doing a little Georgian row house. There's a built form here I've seen a few times, and I really like it, which is that you have something that looks from the front, looks like a heritage house, but actually it's a row house that goes deep into the lot, and you could get 3 or 4 units. I mean, there are great examples of things we can do that play off the same criteria, and I, as much as, I make my living and my heart and soul lies within this ADU kind of laneway house thing, I think the what of it is less important than what the outcome of it is, right? What the built form gives us is more important than what the built form is, right? So and so one size doesn't fit all, and I think there's opportunities for other forms of housing that function similar or have the same end results, and they all need to be promoted. And what we need to walk away from is going, our solution for housing affordability is going to be found by bigger development projects, which I just think inherently have an antithetical drive to creating affordability. You have to make money to make affordability. What if things cost less to make? And what if your expectations in making them weren't driven by the same level of profit motive? And what if the ability to do that was much more achievable? I just can't see how the two, how the one is privileged over the other, right? I mean, I think that to say that affordability can't be done in these little skirmishes here and there and here and there, and to be done widespread is very naive, because it's exactly, if history teaches us lessons, that's how we created our cities. We started with these little, people would build up here, people would build like a little cottage until they had the money to build a house, or they'd live in a tent in the backyard until they built a house. And people had more than one family living in houses. Like we that period of austerity that we had when we started building our cities up here, like for us in BC, it's usually there are not many cities that are more than 10 decades old. That kind of austerity that we had then led us to great decisions about how those neighborhoods developed. And those are some of our most dynamic neighborhoods in Vancouver. For people who are familiar with it, Strathcona, which is this beautiful, dense, Victorian sort of themed neighborhood, is probably the gem of the city as far as I'm concerned. And we have lots of houses and little houses behind houses, and they're narrow and they work together. And I know you have areas like that in Portland and certainly San Francisco. And we're going to hit another really big period of austerity, with the pandemic, and we're going to have to think about what our cities are going to be like. And the good news is that we've already had successful examples, right? You look at San Francisco after the fire, and those little cabins that you had, shelters that you had, they were great housing. And if San Francisco had a whole bunch of that housing available to people, it would really benefit the city. And it's no small coincidence that the ADU program in California in the Bay Area is very progressive, and we're going to really see it come into some great fruition in the next few years, right?
What's the receptivity of this message in smaller municipalities and towns?
It's uniformly, I'd say it's good. I think you're hard pressed to go to a place in North America and have this discussion in a city of anything, a city or a town of any sort of reasonable density, and not have an issue with affordability. Housing affordability is the biggest North American problem. And we have this problem because we developed in a manner that needs to evolve. And the longer we sort of drag our heels on that, the bigger the problem we're going to have. And, obviously it's not uniform in the sense of what's happening in, say, areas of impoverished areas of Chicago. It's going to be a lot different than what happens in Palo Alto, right? I mean, obviously there are different drivers, but when we look at what we can do to stimulate neighborhoods, this is probably the best thing we can do, right? The best thing we can do is create really humane housing that meets people's financial needs and meets their core needs of shelter, but having that housing be, beautiful, whatever that might mean to somebody, having it be ground orientated, and having it create thriving neighborhoods because you have appropriate density, right? And by appropriate density, you just don't have, like you look at those housing developments that you had in New York or this, in Toronto. Sometimes you have too much density, and it's too much density because there's this no equity within the sense of space and neighborliness. But if you look at a city overall and you look at density around its, how many people per hectare, you need to spread that out, and that's where I think you get a city that thrives, right?
Jake, after building 300 laneway houses, do you see a way that they can become more affordable? Because we have very similar markets in that the drivers of affordability or unaffordability is really the permitting cost, the financing cost, the labor cost, and materials. So if you're building one of these things for $400,000, it's still quite a hefty price tag. Is there a way that we can advocate to municipalities to make it more affordable in the future?
Well, it's a good question, right? And we have to see where, it's not a simple answer though. That's the problem, is that we have to see where do these ADUs, lane houses, where do they sit in the housing spectrum, right? And then what's the affordability within that housing spectrum? If somebody is making less than $20,000 per annum, it's going to be tough to go, well, we can make an ADU that's going to be cost effective for that individual. And that's not where necessarily the housing, that's not what this should be delivering, right? Not that it should be exclusive, I'm not suggesting that, but I think we have to adjust our expectations to where does this fit in, right? What we don't have in North America is generally, what is the downsizing unit for, that family who went through the 70s and 80s and, had a life of acquiring things, and now someone's out of the workforce and they're looking to make their life a little simpler and raise their standard of living, but not necessarily have more stuff. They don't have a lot of places to go. And that young family with one kid coming up, who have reasonable jobs, career jobs, but are still outside the affordability of a housing market, they don't have anywhere to go. And that's really where the sweet spot is for the laneway house link. So what we've been working on lately is two things. We're calling it perpetual affordable housing. And what we're looking at is advocating for, in the context of a lane house, that a lane house could be subdivided from a property and become an item that was not just for rental anymore, but become this kind of housing stock for that part of the housing spectrum. And we see some great opportunities. One, because the land's already owned, right? So so no one's acquiring land to do something with the land to make money both on what they've done with the land. So they're making money off a construction project plus a land acquisition. We're looking that this housing would be, a homeowner working with a builder. They put in an ADU. They're not expecting a land lift. They're just expecting reasonable profit from the construction project. And that the municipality, within its regulatory, would facilitate that, but also perhaps put in a covenant on what that house could be sold for or resold for. So again, taking the speculation out and naturally giving a very organic suppression on the price. So all of a sudden, then that project that costs $300,000 could be on the market for not 3 times the cost of production, right? Which would be the normal kind of a development model. Also, the principal residence could be sold, and the homeowner could live in the lane home. And then when that lane home is sold or ADU sold, there'd be a further reduction because the lion's share of the profit would already been generated. So that's one idea. We're also been looking at, well, can you take an older home and further develop that project? So all of a sudden get a lot more density and a lot more living units on a property, but still have an aesthetic pleasing facade. But take all that land lift, all the value that you do in that project, and drive it into a 1 or 2 units out of that development being targeted for that family of mean income level, like in our case, $80,000. So you take all the value of the land, and normally when a developer works with the city's extracting profit that goes into there. And there's also a thought that there needs to be a community amenity that's going to be generated with that profit that the city takes. So we're saying, well, forget that. Let's have a single lot development. The community amenity will be the affordability outcome. And we have a couple of units that forever will stay affordable to a family of mean income level, and a couple of units that are at market. And again, a super viable option. It won't be for everybody, and it won't be for every part of every city, but it's a terrific way to, again, get the housing solutions that we need performed by the people who currently own the land that directly benefit the people that will become their future neighbors, and have that executed by a workforce that's already intact, which is builders and already in the neighborhoods building, and do so in a way where the profit for all the entities is completely reasonable, but there's not a speculative dynamic to it, which layers on this further requirement of profit, which pushes prices from $600 a square foot to 800, and in some cases from 800 to 1200 or 1400, and those are the death by 1,000 cuts, right? And we need to work out an equation, and it's not complicated, and it's not that it hasn't been done. It's just we need to kind of get back to that thinking and facilitate that thinking. The good news with these initiatives is if they're successful and they benefit the people that they're intended to, they'll be successful initiatives. If they don't benefit those people, then the projects won't happen, and it's like a no harm, no foul scenario. And that's what we need to work on, right? I mean, we can't have a regulatory bodies trying to create our creative ideas, right? We need to let the neighborhoods come up with creative ideas, and the regulatory bodies just to make sure that they're safe, right? And that they promote the type of neighborhoods that they need to be promoting. And that's these are the discussions that really keep us going, and I think those are ones that increasingly across North America, everyone's struggling with this. And as we go into what by all accounts is going to be another really tough recession, these shelter issues, which have been a problem and in the front dash of everyone's radar, they're going to be like front and center, and that's all people are going to be looking at, because we have to have shelter, right? We have to, it's the core thing we need, food and shelter, and we're going to have some challenges.
This is why I was very much looking forward to getting into this conversation, and really, you're not just promoting, hey, let me go build more laneway houses or ADUs, but it's how do we progress the sustainable development of our communities, and what you're advocating for is a ground up approach that is so much more holistic, and it has a different feel to these projects, and it very much is driven by each homeowner and where they are in their life cycle, and I do have a lot of hope because of people like you that are blazing the way, and I hope a lot of people can even jump on to what you're doing, because I would imagine you've seen a lot of people come into this space since 2005 and have continued on the efforts that you and others have pioneered.
Oh yeah, there's some great voices in this field, and there's some great advocates, right? Like, I mean, Governor Newsom down in California, I mean, he's all in on this, right? And there's more people in California than there is in Canada, right? Just for clarity, right? And I think the Bay Area, I don't know, it'd be interesting. I think the Bay Area has probably got the population of BC. So, I mean, there is, you need those political champions. And I think there's a lot of buy-in, because I think the politicians, and I mean this in the best way, they need those solutions, and they need to understand how those solutions fit in. And we're always, I think, in a political level, we're always trying to balance that. How would this be received by the people who supported me where I got here? And I think this is where we're at this lovely tipping point. Obviously, our political environment is different than you have, and your political environment is probably a lot different than Memphis, right? I mean, it's and it is going to be always a bit of a dance. But the one thing that's really nice about that ADU thing, and by that I mean this discussion around the ADU, around that, is it kind of works on two levels, because it's both a very social action and a socially minded action, but it also, I think it also satisfies that very libertarian dynamic, which is my property, my rules, right? And why can't I do what I want to do? And I think, it addresses more than one voice, and not to sound manipulative, but it directly benefits the person that it's most going to impact. And, that's a very satisfying thing, because it does create that opportunity. You mentioned grassroots, but it really creates that opportunity where the people who are most going to benefit from this are actually people who'll be living beside these and living in them. And those are, it's hard to kind of push back against that, right? It's not politically dangerous if it can be put in that context.
Permissive zoning instead of restrictive zoning, I think, is
completely, yeah.
Well, Jake, I really appreciate your time, and I encourage all the listeners to go visit your site at Smallworks. And you're also the co-founder of Small Housing BC, where a lot of your advocacy efforts go through as well. And so I do encourage everybody to check out your work and to follow your work, because I know that I am, and I really appreciate you coming on.
Oh, that's great. Thanks so much. I really appreciate it too.